All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. We are live with Poker Fluency for our first weekly study grind. So thank you everybody for being here. It is Tuesday evening. It is the 27th of January, 2026. And we're going to go through some out of position c-bet spots this evening. So this is at the request of the YouTube subscribers. So you guys have voted for this. I appreciate everybody who voted in the poll that I put out the other day. And we're going to use this topic as a good starting point for the general flow that these sessions are going to adopt and the general pattern that we're going to follow. Really what it's going to be is an example of how I think we can best set up a well-rounded study process for ourselves once we've decided on what type of spot we want to study. So in this case, we're going to start to say, okay, let's say we begin with the premise that I am wanting to improve my out of position c-bet spots. If that's the case, then I want to start to build an understanding of these spots that's going to allow me to study them effectively and to figure out where I might be making mistakes. So what we're going to start with is, first of all, if you guys, anybody who's out there in the chat, if you can let me know that you're hearing me okay, let me know that everything is coming through clearly on the audio. I would appreciate that. Secondly, thank you to Tom Hopkins 9145. Thank you for joining the membership at the Grinder tier. I appreciate that. You are going to get early access to all the videos as they come out and as I edit them together and put them up on the channel. So I appreciate that. I am going to start by diving into some aggregate reports. And the reason for starting with that is simply based on wanting to looks and sounds good. Thank you. Welcome, Tyler. Welcome, Hostito. Appreciate you guys being here. So we're going to start with some aggregate reports. We're going to start with just getting a general perspective on how we want to understand the big picture of a specific scenario. Thank you, Maverick. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Appreciate you guys. We're going to start with looking at an aggregate report for an early position spot. Hey, Dustin, welcome. Welcome, welcome. So we're going to look at an early position spot and a late position spot. So we've got basically under the gun versus under the gun 1 or U8 versus U7 here. And then we're going to go to cutoff versus button. We're sticking around 60 big blinds just to give, fairly deep stacks to get a sense of the overall properties of the situation. The first thing that is going to be relevant for out of position c-bet spots is just that based on the fact that the pre-flop ranges are relatively symmetrical, we're not going to have too many spots crop up that we have a big range advantage. So in fact, I'll just go quickly forward to backward to the pre-flop ranges here. We've got the pre-flop raising range for the under the gun 8 player on the right here. And we've got the flatting range for under the gun 7 here on the left. Now, as you can see, obviously the pre-flop raising range is a bit wider than the flatting range, but because the flatting range is pretty robust, because it's going to be, not excessively wide here, it's going to interact quite well with a lot of boards. And there's going to be very, very few boards on which this range is actually weak. And that inherently is going to mean that Ronin Traveler, welcome. Hey, Seth. Didn't realize it was you. Thanks, buddy. Glad to see you here. We're not going to see too many spots where we have a weak range in this formation, right? The symmetrical or slightly symmetrical nature of the ranges is going to mean that we have to play pretty cautiously going to the flop. Now, the spots where we are going to be able to have a little bit more flexibility to play a bit more aggressively are going to be where there is less symmetrical ranges pre-flop. So if we were to compare, let's say, under the gun versus button, let's say, right? So under the gun opens and we look at button. The button flatting range clearly here is much wider than the under the gun 7 range. And not only that, but there's various hands in this range that don't exist in the under the gun range. The under the gun range, they're actually both about 17% of hands, but the hands that don't exist in the flatting range are obviously the strongest ones. And the hands that do exist in the flatting range are a lot of these suited connector, suited gapper type hands that they don't exist in the raising range. So that's going to be where there's some asymmetry there that's going to affect the way that the ranges are going to interact with each other. If we now look at a wider range situation, let's say we look at cutoff button, well, obviously there's not really going to be a situation where we open a wide range and then we get flatted by a very tight range. I mean, maybe that would happen if there was some ICM going on. But as you can see, we open a wide range in the cutoff. The button is going to flat a fairly wide range as well. But again, it's going to be somewhat reflective of a lot of stuff that's going to interact pretty well against that opening range. It's not going to be super wide, and it's going to be a lot of stuff that has decent equity, is generally slightly ahead of that opening range. We're only flatting 16% here compared to the 36% opening range, right? So first thing is that best case scenario, we're going to end up going to the flop with a slightly stronger range than our opponent. There's not really going to be very many situations where we go to the flop with a substantially stronger range than our opponent, unless the opponent is flatting way too wide of a range, right? The only way that we can end up going to the flop with a much stronger range is if villain is flatting too wide. They're just flatting too many hands, not a lot of equity, and way too many weak hands in their range across every board texture, right? That's the only real way we're going to be able to have some kind of super aggressive out of position post flop strategy. So that just kind of ends up in a position where we have to go into every out of position spot recognizing that we just aren't going to be that aggressive. We aren't going to be able to go overboard, doing a lot of c-betting, and we're not going to face too many situations where we're going to be able to, just apply a ton of pressure. So we are going to have quite a few spots where we have to do a lot of checking, where a lot of our hands are going to, prioritize check raising, and so on. So to just kind of give an overall blueprint here for, let's say, this tight range, early position versus early position kind of a spot, where the ranges are both pretty narrow, you can see that the overall frequencies are not high, right? We're checking 68% on rainbow boards, we're checking 70% on two-tone boards, and 73% on monotone boards. So if we look at, maybe some of the boards where we do have the highest betting frequencies, there's only a few range bet boards that are rainbow in this spot, and only a few two-tone, and then monotone, there's none, right? There's no range bets here. So best case scenario, there's very, very few range bets in this formation. Because of the fact that the ranges are so tight, it's just not really going to exist that there's boards where we have, a significant range advantage, or villain is going to have tons of weak hands. The only boards that do exist that are fairly good for us to the point where we get to potentially range bet or close to it, it's a lot of these high card boards, two high card boards, where our opponent has enough low pocket pairs and suited connector hands and things like that that are going to be in some rough shape here. To the point where we get to basically range bet, right? But even then, there's not going to be a lot of it. So basic bottom line here, very, very few range bets in a spot like this. And if we look at the cutoff button scenario, not a lot is really changing. In fact, the fact that our opening range is now so wide is actually starting to increase some of our checking frequencies in some of these cases. In particular, excuse me, we now have a lot of offsuit hands that we wouldn't have from under the gun. So in fact, there's actually even more checking here on the two-tone boards. It starts to now be a bit more significant whether or not the board is rainbow or two-tone, which is quite interesting. But if we look at the same thing again, we look at the highest frequency bet boards. Again, ace 9-9, it's one where they have a lot of low cards, but really not a lot of range betting going on. Very, very little of it, in fact. Go around here, ace 9-9 again, monotone, no range bets, not even close to range betting a monotone board there, right? So generally having to be very passive, having to be quite conservative as a whole, just based on the fact that these boards are not really going to give too many weak hands to our opponent, right? So these boards are just not going to allow us to do a lot of, applying pressure with the bottom of our range and so on. So that's kind of the first thing. Overall, frequency-wise, not really going to be too many boards where we're able to bet a lot. If we then look at kind of the distribution of the bet sizes here, well, you can see that there are a few boards that allow a decently high frequency of this B66 size. So let's take a look at that first of all, or not first of all, but let's take a look at that next. And what you'll see is that this B66 size is actually surprisingly common on some textures here, specifically because the small size would give our opponent a lot of easy floats, a lot of easy calls that maybe have like a backdoor, something like that, but this 66% actually starts to apply a bit of pressure. And in particular, you can see the boards that are really good for this. You've got a lot of king highs where we have the ace king, we have the pocket aces, and they don't. And then there's also a lot of king and queen high monotone type stuff, which is a little surprising, but it kind of makes sense because when you think about it, if the board is king or queen high and it's monotone, then in this formation, the under the gun 7 player is very unlikely to have a flush because a lot of the flush cards they do have contain the king or the queen. So that ends up kind of contributing quite a bit here. So there is a good amount of this medium bet size being used on some of these textures, and it's not always the ones that seem the most intuitive. It's not always the ones that are going to have like flush draws, a little bit of connectivity. It's actually a lot of these king high and even some of the paired boards here where nobody really ever has trips, and so you just kind of discount the pair and you just sort of move forward from there, right? Same thing is going to roughly be true in this cutoff versus button spot. If we look at the board textures where the 66 is being used, there's very little of it on the monotone, as we saw before, but there's now quite a bit on some of these low card paired boards, less so the king high now, so not quite leveraging the ace king and the aces as much anymore. Instead, we're just putting some pressure on some of those overcards and using a bit of this B66 on some of these boards where villain doesn't really have a lot of trips, and we can still have some decently strong hands there, but still not really a huge frequency of aggression, not really a lot coming in there. And at best here, we're looking at situations where, we're using a 2/3 size 80% of the time. So, if we were to up that to 3/4, it would probably go down to, 70% or so, something like that. Slightly polar strategy, but not significantly. So that's the second category. And then the final category is boards where we're basically checking everything, checking our entire range. And as you can see, somewhat predictable what these boards are going to be. In this early position formation, it's a lot of the ones that just absolutely smash that flatting range. They smash that under the gun 7 range because that range contains all 3 sets on all of these boards, maybe some of the trips, maybe some of the 2 pairs and so on as well. So you can imagine that we would want to check everything there. And we'll take a look at a couple of those boards where we can explore, what hands do we check raise and so on. Same goes for the 2-tone boards. A lot of those connected ones, the middle ones that have like an 8 or a 9 on them, definitely going to be checking a lot. Same for the monotone as well here. So just a lot of very consistent trends there. And as far as the cutoff button spot goes, there is a little bit of a change here because there's not as many range check spots. You can see with the monotone, it's very much the low card monotone boards. And then with the other boards, it's actually a lot of the paired 10-10X, Jack-Jack-X type stuff, which is a little bit unusual, but it kind of reflects the fact that the pre-flop flatter is going to have quite a lot of those broadways in their range that flop trips there. So that's going to be part of the equation in that spot. But generally, you can see a little bit more room for aggression on these boards in this formation, but not a ton. Still a lot of checking going on there, not really a lot of betting. So that's the overall sort of construction. It's the overall, big picture across all the boards here. But when it comes to individual boards, we now want to start to try to get a sense of how we're constructing. And the basic rule of thumb here, as far as construction, range construction for out of position c-bet spots, is that we're going to want to be more equity driven with our bluffs. So what I mean by that is we're going to want to not really pick the bluffs at the very bottom of our range. We're going to want to pick bluffs that have at least some ability to improve in a lot of cases. So to show you what I mean by that, let me load up a couple of these boards. So we're going to go with King 3-3. Let's actually just duplicate that. Go back here. King 3-3. We're also going to go, let's duplicate that. I'm going to pick the King 3-3 and then let's pick like Queen 5 deuce with a flush draw, something like that. That should be pretty good. Let's go. Queen 5 deuce, flush draw, Queen 5 deuce, review sim. Okay, so we're looking at a couple of spots where we're using this 66% size and we're not really doing it with, super high frequency. In fact, the King 3-3, we are doing it pretty high frequency. So this is maybe not like the best example here, but you can see to some extent that there's a couple of factors going on here that relate to specifically the hands that are choosing to check. And if we ignore the weight of these hands, we can kind of see a little bit of what I mean. The first thing is that we've got this area down here. If I highlight kind of this stuff a little bit below the top, there's a little bit more of a region here of hands that's preferring to check, just kind of in this area, which is a lot of these pocket pairs, right? And then we've also got the very bottom of the range. The absolute weakest stuff in the range is mostly checking, right? Now, this is not a hard and fast rule here, but it is pretty good as a general rule of thumb that if you're out of position and you're not range betting, which of course you're mostly not going to be, then the very weakest hands in your range are usually going to want to check and just be part of your give up range. And we'll see that probably a bit more on the Queen 5 deuce here. If I load up this Queen 5 deuce, if we unignore the weight, then you can very much see here on the right hand side that everything in this area, let me just sort of filter that and just pull this across, everything here is basically pure check. There's a tiny shred of King 7 here is right there. Let's just kind of move that out. And there's a tiny bit of 7-6 of clubs here because it has 3 to a flush and 3 to a straight. But other than that, the very bottom of the range is just always checking here, right? So we wouldn't really see this in an in-position spot. In an in-position spot, we would see the very bottom of the range having at least some reason to bet. We would see, you know, quite a lot of betting going on with some of the very weakest hands in the range. But from out of position, we don't see that. From out of position, we see much more of a desire to be fairly equity driven in our flop construction. And the problem, or the difficult part, comes when it's not really that easy to pick an equity driven range, right? If we were to look at how we choose an equity driven bluffing range on, let's say something like, let's try to pick like this 995, right? We're betting about half the time on 995 in this situation. We think about what the equity-driven bluffs are going to be. Well, because there's not really any obvious draws here, it's a little bit harder to figure out. We do actually even have some hands kind of towards the bottom of our range that are bluffing here. But part of the reason for that is that even the very bottom of our range in this spot is actually pretty decent in terms of equity. If we're sorting by equity at this point, right? And the very, very weakest hand in our range is 10-8 of spades. And even that has about 20% equity. And it has overcards to a 5, overcards to some pocket pairs. So it doesn't really do that badly when it gets called here. So this is kind of a bit of an interesting spot in that there's not really any obvious hands that definitely need to check, because even the bottom of our range is in kind of okay shape. But you can see that there's definitely a trend there where, we're not really able to pick, a very specific region of bluffs there because of the nature of the board. If we were to look at some kind of a monotone flop, let's see if we can pick like Jack 8-4 monotone. This one I expect will probably have a lot of checking. And we only bet 25% here, so we're not really doing a lot of betting at all. But you can see there, even in this kind of a spot, the very, very bottom of the range, other than a couple of combos, the very bottom of the range is pretty much mostly just giving up, right? So pretty decent rule of thumb there is we're going to largely just give up a lot with the bottom of our range. So keeping that in mind, what we're going to do is I'm now going to switch over to doing a few trainer exercises. So I want to run a few reps. Just kind of put in a little bit of practice in a spot like this. I do think I had already created a drill for this, did I? My drills. Got all the octopi drills in here for those of you who are involved in the octopi challenges. And we've got, where was it? Cutoff out of position. Okay, under the gun 8, out of position, single raise pot, 25 big blind plus. That's what we're going to do. So, it's funny we got 955 here. This is under the gun button, first of all, right? So we're going to do some trainer drills, just kind of reinforce these concepts. The first thing we want to keep in mind is that we are facing this slightly wider button opening range, button calling range. We're also in a position of, having a bit of a stronger range pre, because we have that under the gun range. We are playing with the RNG enabled here. So what we have to decide, first of all, is do we think our hand takes pure action one way or the other? And usually, pretty good rule of thumb here is for a lot of these out of position situations, it's much less common for certain hands to take pure action. it's certainly going to be pretty frequent that you'll see a mix going on. And so it's a little bit more straightforward to kind of default to the RNG here as far as what action we take. So with the RNG being 69, I think generally I'm going to lean to think that we probably don't have a lot of small bets here. We probably just bet the B66 or check. And because we're picking between those options and we have a high RNG, I think I'm going to pick the B66 option. Yeah, okay, so we actually do have a little bit of small bet there, but we did pretty well according to the RNG. We picked the right frequency there, so we did pretty well with that one. The turn card now being an ace of hearts. To start to go into talking about turns here, the thing to keep in mind again is that we're going to be more equity driven with our bluffs on this street as well. So we're going to have to be more driven towards having hands that have hearts, hands that have gut shots. Even just one heart is going to be quite important here. I don't think we're ever really going to bet this turn with this hand. So I'm just going to check, especially because we rolled an 8 with the RNG. Let's see. Usually when it takes its time, it means we got it right. So I think we got it right. Come on, Octopi, don't pause too long. All right, yeah. So it is pure check. That's good. Goes check, check on the turn, and then we see a queen on the river. Now, this is an interesting spot. I'm curious what you guys would do here. Is there anybody in chat who wants to, let's say, is there anybody who wants to bet big here? What do you guys think about the big bet? Do we think that the big bet is good, bad? Anything that we particularly might want to say about the big bet? The option for the big bet could be, fairly dicey here, I think. I'm not really a particularly big fan of the big bet, simply because it seems very, very difficult to really get called by worse, and also very difficult to get anything better to fold. In fact, I think the only options that realistically make a lot of sense here are going to be the block option, which is the 4 big blind option here for 25%, and maybe the check as well. Now, there might be, block bet small to medium. Okay. Yeah, I think anytime we start to get into the medium territory, if we get to like half pot, it's not really as much of a block size. But I do think the small size is going to work pretty well. And if we look at the RNG here, so king bet 50 with a queen. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it could be. We could be able to get a little bit of value from like a 9 here. I do think it's mindful that, or we have to be mindful that the river did complete a flush. We also have to be mindful that ace high is very much part of the flop call range, so an ace is out there still. I'm a little bit more inclined to go block size, especially since we rolled a 44. I think if we had rolled like 80 plus, I might have gone with the B50, but we're going to go block. Let's see. Oh, yeah, it's pure block. Wow, okay. So yeah, 100% block here. The queen is a very good card for the block size, it looks like. So we did go in the right direction there. We do have some B50 here, but it's mostly an ace. An ace is kind of going B50, and a queen is going B25. DST9481 says check. Okay, yeah, I mean, I think check is completely reasonable here. But we are losing a little bit of EV compared to the B25. A lot of block betting from out of position in a lot of these spots. Now, interestingly, we get raised. So here's a question for you guys. We're getting raised in this spot. We have to try to establish what the threshold is that is going to exist for the raise here, right? So what is the weakest hand that villain can raise for value here? Is it only a flush? Can they raise a 5 if they still have it? Can they raise an ace even? What do you guys think? Is there any of you guys think that we're getting raised by an ace here? Or is it just a 5 or better? Or do we think maybe it's even just a flush? Any thoughts out there at all? Let me know what you think. I'm going to talk through this spot as far as what we think the priorities of king queen are going to be, and I'll let you guys answer that question right there. So Seth thinks ace x plus can raise. DST thinks just a 5 plus. Okay. I think when we're talking about king queen specifically, what we want to be aware of here is that having a queen here doesn't really change much at all, except for maybe we maybe are blocking ace queen, which is a hand that can exist. Queen 5 is not really relevant here, so the fact that we have a queen of clubs is not really a factor there. So Seth thinks ace X with a heart can possibly raise. Okay. The other factor, of course, is that we don't have a heart in our hand. And when we don't have a heart in our hand, it's going to definitely impact our ability to bluff catch. However, there will occasionally be times like this where a hand of this sort of nature, where we're block betting, will actually turn into a bet 3-bet bluff, right? Now, we did roll an 18 here, so most likely we're not going to go with that option. But it is worth noting that if we had something like king queen with a heart, it's not necessarily the case that that hand would prefer to just bluff catch. It might actually prefer to rebluff all in. However, I might be a little bit more inclined to think that something blocking pocket nines might be better. So something of the 9x, maybe the best one here would be like ace 9 ace 9 beats another ace, so ace 9 is probably not necessary. But if we had something with a 9 in it, I wouldn't be shocked if we were to jam here. I think we are going to just fold this combo, especially because we rolled an 18. Oh wow, so it does. Okay, interesting. So if we load up the sim here, let's just look straight away at this one. We did get raised by pocket deuces, so we got wrecked by George there. George the octopus in the solver absolutely is in there. Am I blocking with a 9? Occasionally, probably not a lot, but occasionally I think it might be in there. Ace queen is basically the bottom of the raising range. There's a little shred of ace jack there's ace jack with the jack of hearts, ace king with the king of hearts. So yeah, I mean, ace X with a heart was pretty accurate there, Seth. Certainly. What's interesting here is that villain actually never has trips, right? So they literally never check back a 5 on the turn, which is quite interesting. And then flushes and full houses are preferring to raise a bigger size here. So that was kind of the giveaway there, or at least the kind of major variable that we were thinking about. If we look at the river, you can see that there is some 9x that's blocking here. We've got like some king 9, we've got some queen 9 in there, we've got some jack 9, some 10 9. So there is a little, sort of bits and pieces of some 9x, because villain does have hands like 8s and 7s that are kind of indifferent against the block there. So we can potentially block with that size. But if we look at our response against the raise, against this 50% raise, we've got kind of an interesting breakdown here, because you can very much see that there's a clear region of value, like any flush has to just jam, right? Then we've got like ambiguous jams where like ace queen is very borderline. Then we've got this region here, which is the bluff jams. And in fact, it's basically the queen with a heart at a pretty decent frequency here. King of hearts queen is bluff jamming quite a lot. Queen 9 is also bluff jamming because it has a lot of good full house blockers. Tyler says, is it just my side the audio is going out? If anybody is getting any audio issues, do let me know. Hopefully we are not having that. I'm not seeing anything on my side that would indicate any audio issues, so it could just be Tyler's side. I don't know. You guys let me know. Hopefully we're not. All good here? Okay. So fingers crossed, no audio issues. But you guys let me know if anything does change. No issues. Okay. Thanks, guys. Appreciate that. Hopefully it's just Tyler. Apologies, Tyler. Hopefully you can get it sorted. Where were we? So the block jam, or the block and then jam over the raise hands, a lot of it is a queen. There is a little bit of some other king queen in there. So we don't actually have to have a flush blocker here. We actually prefer to have a full house blocker, but as you can see, not really a big deal. So let's focus back on the flop. Let's go back to the out of position c-bet line. This is a really interesting one. This time we get under the gun 8 versus under the gun 7. We also get a king 9 4 flop at 40 big blinds. And in particular, we now have a gut shot straight flush draw. You're out in the boonies at work with a storm. Yeah, it might be that. Might be the storm. So the board texture that we have here, I think with the hand that we have, it's really easy to just default to like, oh, I want to go big bet, right? It's really easy to just be like, oh, I have all the equity in the world. And it's not really going to be that much of a disaster by any means, but it is worth noting that I think we're probably not really targeting a lot by using the B66 here. I kind of feel like we might actually be in a spot where the B25 is a little better, just because those low boards. Hey, Matthew Rebel, thank you. Check raise sounds good, but we also, we want to consider that. So Seth says also check raise. The key thing here is that we want to first decide on our betting and checking range distribution, and then decide on check call versus check raise. We don't have to preemptively decide on a check raise, because there will be some spots where we should not try to check raise because we're not going to face a bet very often if we check, right? And this is actually probably going to be a spot where I wouldn't really expect villain to bet a lot if we do check to them. It's usually going to be maybe half the time or so. It's going to kind of average out to about half the time in a lot of cases. So I'm actually leaning a bit towards small bet here, especially since we rolled a 55. If we'd rolled a bit higher, I might go big bet. I'm going to go small and we'll see. Yeah, okay, so we got it. So if we look at it, yeah. All right, so there is a little bit of big bet here. There is a little bit of the B66. But in fact, the small bet is pretty good just because there are not a lot of hands that have a tough spot against B66, but there are quite a few of those pocket pairs and some ace highs that have some awkward spots against that B25. So the 25 works slightly better here. Now, if we had rolled a low number here, if we had rolled like I don't know what I would have done if I'd rolled like a 35. I probably would have still bet small. But if I rolled like a 5, then I might have just checked. And then subsequently, we would probably have check raised. But we don't have to preemptively decide to check raise before we've actually decided on a check to begin with. Now, we do bet small and we get called. Turn is a jack. I'm pretty inclined, strategy-wise, I think here that the natural option is probably going to be that we either go with the 5.3 or the 9.5 as the bulk of our betting volume. I don't think there's really going to be a lot of purpose behind going with the 2.7 here. It's not really a lot of thin value in our range. I do think that if we bet here, one second. I do think that if we bet here for one of those larger sizes, we're probably reasonably unlikely to get significant value from worse. And I'm kind of leaning a bit more towards check as a result. We rolled pretty low. I'm going to check. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. Wow. It's literally exactly 50-50 between check and small bet. That's more small, more small betting than I was expecting here. Probably just representative of villains still having, relatively weak range, I guess, at this point. Probably a lot of the 9X and stuff like that. So Matthew Rebel says my audio is broken too. Okay. Yeah, you guys let me know. With all the weather conditions going around recently, I really don't know whether it could be my end or your end. I'm not seeing anything on my OBS here that indicates that there's some kind of an audio problem. So it's not really, not really clear to me. Still no issues before winning. Thank you. Okay, so right now, it may just be you guys, unfortunately. Sorry about that. Probably just one of those weather things going on recently, which is very annoying. But yeah, we do check. So we mixed for check on the turn. Still good, I think. So at least the recording should be good. Yeah. I mean, the recording should come out good if you guys need to check back in for that. So we do face a bet here, and I think this is one where we now have to start to think a little bit about, oh, good, now switch to PC. Okay, cool. We do have to start to, I think, consider whether there's merit to a check raise here, right? Because whether or not, and this is why I say we choose the checking range before we decide to check raise, because depending on what size our opponent bets, the possibility, welcome Calvin, by the way. Hey, Calvin. The possibility of raising the value of it is going to change, right? If we are facing a bet like this, half pot or so, there's a big difference between check raising against half pot compared to check raising against full pot, for example. So in this case, we have to think about, which raise size might make sense to include in our strategy, and then which raise sizes might make sense for this specific hand. Now, the small raise size here would create a bigger river SPR, but there may not be very many hands in villain's range here that are particularly indifferent against that size. However, we've got a slightly bigger raise size here, which creates a lower river SPR. And now, maybe there are some hands like a king that start to become in some very weird spots here. But it's not really that easy to figure out one way or the other which of these might be best, especially considering, with this individual hand, again, it's not really that clear whether or not we can actually get better to fold here. So I don't think we want to fall into that trap of just auto check raising every time we have a lot of equity. I actually think this is probably more of a call, especially since we only rolled a 10 here. And let's see. It's taking its time, so we probably got it right. Yeah, okay, almost pure call. There we go. All right, so a little bit of the 50% raise, but not really at all with this hand. 97% call. And there's actually a tiny bit of check jamming with our range here, but not really super necessary to go with that, I don't think. So kind of seeing that small raise didn't really have a lot of functionality here. And as you can imagine, this hand actually does have a pretty good amount of showdown value. So pretty much all of our Jack 10, as you can see there, is basically just check calling. So we don't want to fall into that trap of auto check raising all the equity. We're not really going to do any donking on this river. There's not really a lot of reason for it. So we're going to check. And then villain shoves. Wow. This spot absolutely sucks. Okay, so we have Jack 10 of diamonds. We have to go through this. Yeah, Seth said check call small river bet. Too late on that one, unfortunately. We faced the jam. George is not into small river bets here. He's just jamming because that's kind of what fits his range at this point. So we have to start with establishing what the value threshold is for this. It is about a 1.5x pot jam, a little bit less than that. I do think that it can come from King Queen at some frequency. That's probably the lower end. King 10 is probably very thin, but it might exist in there. There's obviously set of nines is in there, set of jacks is in there, although that's only one combo. Ace King is possibly in there, although that's very low frequency based on pre-flop. Bluff-wise, I would imagine villain is supposed to maybe turn some low pocket pairs into a 2-street bluff here. Probably has deuces again. You know what? If he flatted it pre, he might take that line with this, but I actually think deuces is going to fold pre at 40 bigs at this depth. So thankfully, we probably shouldn't be up against deuces, but he might have like sixes, sevens, some stuff like that. Those hands could be, some reasonable candidates here. The good thing about having Jack 10 of diamonds here, as opposed to one of the other Jack 10s, is that I don't think Under the Gun 7 is going to be bluffing the river with diamonds very much because he's going to be blocking our folding hands. Any busted flush or straight draws, well, there aren't really a lot in villain's range, but there are some of the ace queens and ace 10s. The fact that we don't have a queen in our hand is somewhat helpful. Ace 10 of diamonds we do block, but that might be a hand that he doesn't choose to bluff with because it's diamonds. I think ultimately our hand is kind of neutral as a bluff catcher. I don't imagine this hand is likely to be pure call, or even probably not going to be high frequency call here, because the fact that we block the straight is not super crucial here. There's only 3 combos of Queen 10 suited in the deck left, and not even all of those are in villain's range at pure frequency pre-flop. So I would probably say I think this hand is slightly on the bad side of neutral as far as a bluff catcher goes. And because we rolled a 16, I'm going to fold it. But let's see. Ooh, wow. Okay, so it was actually slightly on the good side of neutral, and I only just made the right call RNG-wise. we're supposed to actually call 82% of the time here. I rolled a 16. If I had rolled a 19, then that would have been an error. So I just about got under the wire on the frequency there. Yeah, it looks like basically the properties we want to have is we want to have a king. We would much rather have king 10 here, although even that is kind of indifferent. 10-9 is kind of indifferent. We actually have a strong enough range here. Wow, that's interesting. I think ace king is actually folding here sometimes. If we have, yeah, we do actually fold ace king sometimes, specifically if we have either the king of clubs or the ace of diamonds. That's weird, but that must be some blocking effects there. Let's look at villain's bluffing range. So it's a very narrow range overall. If we look at the bluffs, it starts here. Queen Jack, is that a bluff? That's a weird merge. That's like a very weird, like they can sometimes get ace king to fold, but occasionally we hero them with Jack 10 kind of a play. That's really odd. Jack 10 of spades, same sort of thing. Pocket sixes. I told you guys sixes might be in there. Sixes, sevens as well. You know, I called it. I called the sixes and the sevens. Would you ever think about this spot similarly to something like the no equity bluffing spot Sam taught us? It is a little bit like that in the sense that when the under the gun 7 player is bluffing here, they want to have some hands that are unblocking our folds as much as possible. But I think what's different, yeah, I think I see what you're getting at, and I think the difference here is that when the ranges are really narrow like this, you're kind of in a situation where it's very difficult to find that many obvious like auto folds or those unblocking effects start to become a little bit less relevant. And instead you want to think about the hands that you're actually blocking. And you have to kind of very ambitiously reach for bluffs sometimes here. So, as an example, in this spot, in position is kind of ambitiously reaching for the pocket sevens and sixes. The 7-6, like 7-6 of spades is in there. Very few people are going to actually just yeet it off with 7-6 of spades here, but you're supposed to. You're supposed to really find those bluffs here. Ace 5 of some of these suits, ace 5 of diamonds here, ace 4 of some of the other suits as well. So there are combos in there that are really tough to find. I think for the most part, that unblocking concept that Sam was talking about is mostly for a lot of spots where the ranges are a bit wider and it's a little bit more for the turn more so than it is on the river, but it is still definitely relevant on the river. It's just a little bit harder to pin it down in situations like this where, we've got a lot of ambiguity about what exactly the portions of range are that are going to be check folding, right? And of course, the 30-second ad hit as you were talking about it. Sorry about the ads. Sorry. I hate putting the ads out there, but sometimes you got to do it, All right, so let's do a couple more. Okay, so this is shallow. So we got tens versus the button, and we flop top set on 10-8 deuce. This is quite interesting. I think what's quite relevant about this spot is that as we start to get shallower, the button is going to have a flatting range that is more concentrated around Broadway cards and less concentrated around the pocket pairs. So what that means here is I think we are probably going to be in a decent spot to bet this board, maybe with the small size at a decent frequency, because I don't think we're up against too many. Oh, okay, mistake. All right, so 0.3% mistake. I guess we don't bet the 25. Probably bet the 50%. Oh, RNG error? Wow, okay. Maybe I guess we check this then. Okay, so, all right, so I did get this one kind of wrong. So we do have bet 50 or check here as our strategy. We don't really use the small size. And then with this specific combo, it's 59-41 in favor of checking because we block all of those top pair hands, which makes sense. It does make sense that we're not going to struggle to get stacks in across 3 streets here. So it's pretty logical that would be the case. Now, it does go check on the flop, and the ace peels off on the turn. Yeah, check top set. I mean, really, I should have thought about it a bit more in those terms. Like check top set on boards like this is never going to be a bad thing. But you can see that it is kind of close here. It is kind of mixing some of that B50 here. So just kind of an interesting one there. The ace comes on the turn, and I feel like at this point, we're pretty much just going to be able to go with a pretty polar strategy here. I think we're probably going to either go 4.9 or 6 here, and then just shove a lot of rivers. It's possible that we might do some checking, but I don't really feel like yeah, our hand isn't very vulnerable on this flop. That's a good point, Seth. I don't really think we're going to face a lot of bets if we check here. So I feel like I'm just going to bet 6. I don't feel super great about this one, though. This might be a bit of an error. Let's see. Oh, RNG error. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, B100, the 6 big blinds is basically like B90, right? So it's close enough. It's an RNG error. So we rolled a 46. I would guess maybe that means we'd be 75 instead. No. Oh, wow. That's a blunder. Holy crap. That's really interesting. So how is that a blunder? All right. So that's a 9% blunder. Somehow that's like B92 is fine, and it's just an RNG error. But the B75 is like a 9% blunder. That's crazy. It must be a check. It must be splitting B. That's an RNG error as well. What the hell is this? I'm getting deeply confused and turned around by this spot. Okay, so I guess if the big bet and the check are both RNG errors, then I mean, see, that would normally have made me think like B75 was probably a bit better. Shove? Like, yeah, I mean, I don't know, man. Like, do we just like rip it for 4x pot here? Are we ever jamming? I doubt it. I really doubt it. I guess we probably bet small. RNG error as well. Okay. I guess there must be this is like the only thing that makes sense. Okay. All right. So okay. This makes sense. This makes a bit more sense now, right? Okay. So it's not 46 can't be jammed, can it? No, it's not a jam. It's, so what's going on here is we've got a mix of 25, 50, and the 92. The 75 is the only size that's not used. And that's why that was a blunder here. It's because nothing in the range is using the 75, even though the 50 and the 92 are used at like a good frequency, like a reasonable frequency here. And then this specific hand is literally just mixing all 4 of those options. Check, B25, B50, and B92. So the only thing it's not doing other than shoving is B75. And that was the second option that I picked, which was how we ended up with a big blunder there. Now, I definitely feel like that's kind of harsh because, yeah, it's a blunder, but it's like if I measured the EV of a strategy where we just play B75 or check here and we compare it to this strategy, it's really not going to be a big difference. So, you know, it's a blunder, but it's a blunder that I don't really care about. But I do feel like the interesting aspect here is the fact that all 4 options are being taken, you know, pretty much just like mixing everything with the pocket 10s here. So interesting spot. Now we did go with, I think, the B50 in this line, and we ended up getting called, and now we're on the river with about 20 bigs behind and 13 bigs, relative blunder. Exactly. Yeah. And 13 bigs in the pot. So I feel like we probably just rip here. Like, I just don't feel like there's much, like the blocking factors of double blocking a 10 are just not as relevant anymore. I think we just shove. Yeah, it's pure shove, or it's 99% shove, right? So now it gets pretty simple. Now we're just kind of really prioritizing getting max value from an ace. We are in kind of one of those situations where villain, like in practice here, villain is not likely to bet enough, not likely to bet thinly enough for value. So in practice, I think it becomes even more important not to check here. Is that because 75 is the same as 100 as far as opponent being indifferent, and 100 is more value for us? Probably. If I was to go back here, if I go back to this turn and I just kind of look at what the response is versus each of these sizes, I can't actually look at the full tree. Or at least I can look at the full tree, but if the B75 isn't used, I can't really explore what the response would be to it. But if we look at what happens if we use the B92, I can't really see anything in this range that would be that's like clearly would be calling or would be more indifferent if we were to use B75. So I guess that's probably what's happening. It's just that the B75 doesn't really kind of, we're not really incentivized to kind of give ourselves a bit of a better price because the range that's using the B92 is pretty polar to begin with. So, there's not really any sort of additional benefit to the 75 there. I think that's kind of what's happening here. So let's do one more because we're coming up on, we've gone like 50 minutes so far. We'll do one more spot. Okay, so we've got ace 9-7 this time, and this time we are 80 bigs deep. So U8 under the gun 8 versus button, and in this particular case, I would think that on this board we probably have the B66 and the check. We might have some small bets, but maybe not a lot because I don't feel like at this depth, even under pairs probably don't tend to fold very often here. So rolling a 45, we have a good top pair. I feel like I want to bet here. Oh, 0% mistake. Okay. Thanks for being generous, George. 0% mistake. So if it's a mistake, maybe we bet small instead? Oh, wow. Okay. So it's actually like basically range bet small. That's really interesting. He never raises B92. Yeah, it's a good point about the last one. He also probably would not raise the B75 as well. I think it's just kind of a product of our range being very polar, more so than anything else. We don't really have anything in that betting range that would be indifferent against a raise there. Let's do one more because we just only saw the flop there. Queen 9-5 under the gun 8 versus button. I feel pretty confident that this one probably is the B66, I think, or check. This is likely to be a hand that probably does a good amount of both, probably pretty close. We rolled a 42. I'm going to hit check, I think. Oh, RNG error. Okay, so probably B66. Oh, also RNG error. All right. Huh. Oh, okay, so this is why this was an RNG error. So the sizing is actually split between 25 and 66. In practice, I think you can just kind of split the difference and bet 40% or something here with a lot of hands. You could like range bet 40% here and you'd probably be fine. This specific hand does B66 sometimes, but rolling a 42 equates to B25 here. So we did take us a couple of attempts to get there. Turn is a 6. Now this does obviously complete a straight, but the 7-8 is a pretty small portion of villain's range. Villain does also have pocket 6s. They do also have 6-5. So a couple of hands improve there. I wouldn't expect really to see much overbetting at all here, but I would think that we're obviously going to have a pretty decent chunk of bets. Not sure if this hand is particularly strong or strong enough to do that. I'm going to check. RNG error. Okay, so we rolled a 75. If we're not going to check, what are we going to do? I feel like probably B75 feels best here. Also an RNG error. Okay, so that implies that there is some B75, but it's not kind of, in this territory. So either, well, I guess it would have to be that the B75 it's in there at some frequency, but it's lower frequency than this. I would think it's probably B50. Yeah. Okay. So we weren't that far off. Like, we're doing a lot of checking. We're also using a mix of everything from B25 up to B75. So we're kind of mixing a few different things in there. But yeah, I think this is definitely a pretty complicated spot. But overall, I think to kind of wrap that concept. Oh, so before winning, I had a question. Sorry, let me tackle that. I think when it comes to RNG, there's a couple of things that I would say about it that are important. The first thing is that it's true that even against bad opponents, there are a lot of spots that are close. And the reason is simply not because your opponent is playing really good in a lot of different ways or in a lot of different lines, but because they're making mistakes in every line. So for example, in this particular spot, you might find that your opponent is making a lot of mistakes where you bet and they don't raise you enough. They don't bluff raise you enough, right? but they're also making a lot of mistakes where if you check, they don't value bet enough, or they don't bet enough versus a check as well. And then on the river, they're going to make a bunch of mistakes on top of that, right? So it's sometimes going to be the case that we can pick between options in a very clear way, but particularly on the early streets, it's not always that obvious, even against a bad player, what the actual best option is, because they're making mistakes in a bunch of different ways. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the RNG in-game actually helps to avoid wasting a lot of cognitive effort on decisions that don't particularly matter. So it does help to avoid putting a lot of time and energy into trying to figure out whether I should check raise or check call in a certain situation, because ultimately, they might be both pretty much the same in terms of their overall EV. The final thing that is kind of an aside to this, but it's also important when you are playing in an environment where you think that maybe you have certain biases, to where if you're maybe going through a downswing, if it's maybe higher stakes than you usually play, something like that, if you're going to become a bit more risk averse, then using RNG actually helps to negate that and fight back against that, because it forces you to take aggressive lines, whether you want to or not. So if you have an RNG process in place, it can actually be really useful to prevent yourself from being vulnerable to some of those mental game errors that can creep in when you're under a bit more pressure or things aren't going well, something like that. So there's a lot of benefits to it. It's not mandatory to use it by any means, but you will find that a lot of the time it can save you a lot of time and energy and a lot of effort, and it can also be very, very useful against better players who are certainly going to at least have some idea of your overall frequencies. And even if you are only using it to avoid playing exactly like how everybody else plays in a certain spot, that in itself is going to be an edge, because most good players are going to assume that you play pretty much the same way everybody else does until proven otherwise. And if you can make sure that you take some of the aggressive lines in ways that they don't expect, even if that requires using an RNG, then that's going to help you to make sure that you capture as much EV as possible against those good players, even if they don't really know, exactly how you play, right? It's not about preventing your opponent from knowing exactly what you're doing. It's about preventing your opponent from being able to recognize that there's an obvious mistake that everybody tends to make, and you're also making that mistake as well. So hopefully that's helpful. Cool. All right. So I think that's going to be a good spot to wrap it up. I'm going to hit end on the session there. So we went through a couple of fundamentals for some out of position spots. I'm going to drop a poll on the channel here for what we're going to do next time. Obviously, if you want to check out the replay for this session, please do. Please do like the video before you jump off as well. It'd be great for the channel. And of course, we're going to have more videos coming out very soon. Every day, we're going to keep coming out with some videos. A lot of them will just come out members only first, and then they're going to keep being released publicly day by day. So if you want to get them early, you can grab the membership. If you don't care about that, then that's totally fine. But yeah, thank you, everybody. I'll drop the poll for next week on a post here on the channel. And I appreciate you guys for being here, and I'll see you next time. So we will be back again next week at the same time. Thanks, Hostito, and thanks everybody else for being here. Cheers.